is actually one that we could have looked at historically as one of the first. As Cornel West in that lecture was talking about, this was the first golden age of Harvard, and it was also the first entry of American thinking into Europe. So up to this point, Europe, of course, is the source of all the intellectual traditions that had come to the United States, one form or another, even in the Spanish or the French, but definitely in the English. It was all from Europe. But James, being really trained a lot in Europe, but still was absolutely an American, and ended up in 1900 being the first American to be invited to lecture in Scotland at Edinburgh and give the Gifford lectures there. Royce would follow and be the second. So that's kind of intriguing that we have both Josiah Royce and William James, who were neighbors at Harvard. So notice that Cornel West, in the video that I've posted on the syllabus, weaves together both Royce and West, or rather Royce and James, although in that particular lecture his main topic is Royce, actually. So the emphasis, of course, is on Royce, but James and Royce were very good friends, lived next to one another. A lot of historians are actually upset about that, because as a result of their living next to one another and walking together to their classes, they talked to one another, and that didn't record any of their conversations by doing that. If they hadn't lived next to one another and instead corresponded with letters, then of course they would have bequeathed to history more of their discussions in a way that people would still have reference to. But you can only guess the kinds of topics they had. Because they did disagree. They agreed with a lot of things, but they did disagree on some things. So for example, the lectures that William James gave at the Gifford Lectures at Edinburgh became the book The Varieties of the Religious Experience, which is amazing because you can actually go to a bookstore today and find new copies of that book on sale, even though, 1900, that's 118 years ago. That's pretty odd, especially, by the way, since if you want to read it, it's on the web. You could just look it up on the web, and there are multiple sites that have copies of it, because of course it's not copyright anymore. But nonetheless, the Varieties of the Religious Experience has actually introduced a new approach to the Gifford Lectures. The Gifford Lectures, which you could look up, it's actually a kind of a who's important in the academic world. So you could go to them and look up all the individuals that have been selected to give the Gifford Lectures. Charles Taylor is one of the ones that have been there. I think Daniel Dennett has also, so I can't recall all the folks that I found that were really fascinating. But the focus of the Gifford Lectures is on, as you can see, natural theology. So why James was really significant was because James was a psychologist primarily. We certainly think of him as a philosopher, but his psychology is really his main influence to American pragmatism. Folks will write that if you really want to understand American pragmatism, the best thing for understanding it is to read James's Principles of Psychology, which is American pragmatism, basically. Basically what it does is introduces the idea that electricity is involved. By the time we get to James, electricity has been discovered and used in devices, and James experimented on people in a laboratory, discovering that if you zap people with electricity, their personality changes. Which, by the way, is, I understand it, is still used somewhat today, although I think they use lower doses, and so they have fewer people end up with their hair singed. I don't know how that all works.
They use electrodes that are more targeted now than they used to.
So it used to be scary. I imagine it's still pretty scary if you need that kind of treatment. But if you think about it, wow, this was really kind of a startling development to realize that we have electricity as what the heck would you call it? It seems like you can't actually see electricity. You can't like contain well, you can with batteries, but the idea that we have sort of an electrical system, biochemical of course, but nonetheless we have an electrical system in our brains, and that our thoughts apparently, think of the sudden shock of this, shock, that we have kind of an explanation for how the energy of the thoughts can be explained now. And in any case, that makes us a little bit more of a machine, if you think of it that way. But James, going to the Gifford Lectures, isn't going to talk about God and why God, a particular description of God, is essentially the right one, and theologically correct, and all the other conceptions of God are wrong for one reason or another, which seemed to be the focus before James. I haven't read all of them, but you get the idea. They were concerned about the correct interpretation of God. James arrived as a psychologist, basically saying that if we examine all of these different varieties of religious experience that create all these different major religions, it is like 20 plus specific individuals that he was talking about in the book. By the way, he did all of his research in a library, didn't go out and actually meet any of these significant individuals, so that's considered a fault, because he did all of his research by reading the work of other people, right? But what he goes to argue is that the impact on a person's health, psychological, mental health, is such that belief is a good thing. That even though we have these varieties of religious experience, when you get right down to it, the main impact on a particular individual of these experiences is that you believe in something that's larger than yourself. And that gives you a reassurance, a sense of confidence, a sense that you're loved, that you're part of this bigger picture, etc. And that is all good for us psychologically. So whether or not specific religions have a theology that basically seem to be more correct than some other religion, that doesn't seem to be that interesting for James. What's more interesting for James is the fact that you have a belief available to you that enables you to put yourself into this bigger picture. So that's his approach in the varieties of the religious experience. So still out there, still on sale, which that's kind of impressive to me, and that people will feel that the book is important enough to have their own copy so they can underline, and you know how people do to books of that sort. And Royce is next, and Royce's book, which is also online and not available in bookstores unless you order them, I'm sure, is The Sources of Religious Insight. As you can see, it's actually online, of course, same way. Notice it was 19... I don't know why it's not published till 1911.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Because it should have been right around 1900 as well. Looks like all of the... In any case, so Royce is actually responding to the varieties of the religious experience with this book. And this book's argument is, instead of approaching it from a psychological point of view, merely psychological point of view, it's still taking the approach that there is a theological import to the kind of belief that you have. And for Royce, the main effect of religion, and he doesn't say specifically Christian religion, it's kind of, if you get into reading Royce, it's absolutely gorgeous English literature. He was honed by multiple speaking engagements, and James did the same sort of thing. So both of these individuals would go on tour and give lectures to audiences. Remember, at the time, they didn't have TV, they didn't have radio. So what did people do for entertainment? Normally they would, apart from church, of course, they would go to a theater and watch maybe music, opera, perhaps. But they would also go and listen to lecturers who would give speeches about things. And they did that quite often. I don't know that we do that especially that much today as a source of entertainment. But James was one of those lecturers that was famous and would go all over giving lectures. By the way, Bertrand Russell also did that, although of course that was much later. But so people would still go to hear a lecturer as kind of a way of spending. Iowa Town, would go to the theater to listen to Bertrand Russell giving a lecture. It was very popular, and James was. I'm sure there were lots of people that were very popular for doing that sort of thing. But when you would do that as a routine, go all over the place and give these lectures, you learn how people like different things that you might say, and so you kind of improve your delivery. You know what I mean? Practice makes perfect, and then that turns out to be part of the writing style. So when you read both James and Royce, what you'll find is that their writing style was really beautiful literature. So they really have a way of putting things across without boring you to tears, etc. So really good stuff that way. But for Royce, the main reason that religion is significant for an individual is because we feel like life sucks. Life is horrible, basically, because everything is wrong. You get sick, people die, floods, volcanoes, you name it, all kinds of the problems of evil, etc., all present, and you're upset, and you don't feel like God is a good God, etc., until meet or discover or become part of a group that believes a particular meta-narrative that explains everything to your satisfaction, and at that point, you become saved. So for Royce, being saved is believing a narrative that transforms your mind with regard to how you perceive your place in the universe. So the saving comes in your belief in something then that gives you relief and makes you feel like you are now saved. You're one of the elect who believe that narrative, right? So now you understand why things are the way they are, why God behaves the way God behaves, why people get sick and die, why, et cetera, et cetera. So that's absolutely kind of fascinating to see both of them then playing really on psychology, but the difference being that for Royce, the theological message was the significant reason why a particular religion would be more significant than others. Right? So, but still, the two of them taught side by side in Harvard. For most of the time, James taught psychology and Royce taught philosophy, but James did teach philosophy as well. So that was kind of interesting at that time. Cornel West mentioned quite a few other individuals. By the way, thinking about Cornel West, when we look at him, notice that his father is a Baptist minister. So what's neat about listening to his lectures is he's got his PhD, he's philosophically very astute, current, knows all the stuff that's going on. I don't know how he does it. He's very well read and remembers it. Wow, that's absolutely amazing. How do you remember all that stuff? But nonetheless, he's also got a traditional experience behind him that enables him to speak as if he were preaching. So I don't know if you picked up on that in the little bit that I was playing, but you get the sense of the way he accentuates the words that he uses, so that you get, you notice how that works? I don't know, you pick up, that somehow elevates or makes the lecture more interesting somehow. I don't know if you see how, and it's obviously a speaking technique that you can learn depending on the seminary you go to. I don't know if you get it from speech class, but you definitely would get it from a seminary because of the way those present. You want to hear that a little bit again? I had to go back to,
William James class. I know that Brother McDermott has real challenges in James's class sensibility. But that relationship, that partnership is a cross-class partnership. It's unbelievable. There's nothing like it in the history of not just American philosophy. There's nothing like it in American intellectual life in the last 70 or 75 years. It's even more than Goethe with Schiller at Weimar. This is an American example of two persons, giant geniuses working so closely together. This is what I meant yesterday when I said, there is no Royce without James, in the sense of the Royce that we critically interrogate. But there's no James without Royce, in terms of the James we critically interrogate. They would have had their own trajectories independent of each other, much less impoverished, much more impoverished. Much more impoverished. Now, what is it then about this self-study humanist project? Well, for me, you see, it has everything to do with the baggage that I bring to philosophical discourse and the baggage that I bring to Royce and to James. which is all great self-styled humanist projects put a primacy on the catastrophic, the traumatic, the scandalous, the monstrous, the horrendous, the calamitous. Go to Walter Benjamin, Kafka, Adorno, the grand self-styled humanists of Europe about to descend into totalitarian darkness, the centrality of the catastrophic. And the professional, the specialized is to do what? To tame it, to domesticate it, to hide it, to conceal it, to smooth it out, deodorize it, manicure it. And yet the stink and the stench still oozes out. And some people have to wait for Hitler to acknowledge the catastrophic. Wait for Stalin to acknowledge the catastrophic.
So, you get the style, I think. Pretty interesting. And by the way, he's not alone. There are some other speakers. Princeton seems to have quite a few of them, actually, that speak the same way and have a bit of the same tradition behind them. So it's interesting that we do that. I've never seen a European speak like that. But then that's, who knows, maybe I'm not aware of some that are out there. But when we think of James and we think of the associations that we can make besides Royce, there are others that are pragmatists that are part of what we think of as the beginnings of pragmatism, and that's Charles Sanders Peirce. Have I mentioned him before in this class? I can't recall. We've talked about any of these before. So who are the pragmatists? Besides James and Royce, we have Charles Sanders Peirce, who's officially the inventor of American pragmatism. And what's interesting about Charles Sanders Peirce is that he is primarily a logician and a mathematician. So the aspect of pragmatism that he brings and what he does actually in inventing pragmatism as a school of thinking, the American school of thinking, is to look at language. And remember, he's intellectually, his main influence would have been Immanuel Kant. He would not have been as influenced by Hegel, as far as I know. Right? But Immanuel Kant influenced him, and so he's one of the folks that are trying to see how we can get to that reality, and it's through language, very much the same way that Hegel did. So maybe there is a connection, but I'm not sure. But so how do we interpret language so that we can get through to reality and understand it? And he believes that there is kind of a logical connection. So logic is essentially the connection that makes language successful, right? So there is logic as kind of like a natural law for the way nature works, right? So what we think of as logic, ever since Aristotle, is, it works primarily because nature itself follows logical laws, right? So if we analyze logic and then grammar and then speech making, etc., then what we're doing, of course, is building our understanding on nature, really. So the pragmatists are very interested in science. They're also very interested in evolution, theory of evolution. If you look at the connection, the time they're connected to Darwin, although there's a very specific teacher that will especially influence James, and that's Louis Agassiz. Harvard's name into the mix. Louis Agassiz was originally from Switzerland, a biologist, becomes a professor at Harvard, and while he's there, he's the, so he becomes a professor at Harvard, the Lawrence Scientific School, and very, very popular. In fact, Harvard has a building named in his honor today, so you could go visit his building, I suppose. Actually, I think it's a classroom building for biology. He also created a museum with bones, of all sorts of animals and so on. So he created that kind of stuff that I believe is still there also at Harvard. Of course, it's changed over the years. But he was also a huge guy. When he died, it took an unusual number of people to carry his coffin because he was so big. But James was one of his students, and in fact, James went with him on a trip to the Amazon. And what was interesting about Agassiz's point of view was that he was against Darwin. So he argued that, for example, the reason for the trip to the Amazon was he thought if there was an ice age, then God would have created an ice age all over the world, not just in certain parts of it. And so he went to the Amazon to look for evidence that there had been an ice age down in the Amazon as well. And he kind of sort of thought he found some evidence for it, although James, who was with him, didn't think so. So it's kind of interesting, I suppose. But so you get the idea. He's a very impressive professor. Everyone, yes?
Who are you talking about?
Louis Agassiz.
Okay, sorry, I lost you.
So, if you think about all the interconnections and why Darwin is, on the one hand, exciting to a lot of people, but on the other hand, the main professor that they had at Harvard was anti-Darwin, right? So think of that milieu as a very dynamic fight between what was happening as a result of Darwin and those that were opposed to Darwin's point of view, and Agassiz was part of that. But nonetheless, when we look at pragmatism, we think of their acceptance of evolution as pretty much the rule for pragmatists. Science is very important. So they're all very thrilled with the advances of science. They're also interested in evolution, but they're also American patriots. So all of the pragmatists are American patriots. They're also Democrats. Democrats not in the party, but as opposed the form of government, right? The democratic form of government. We believe that's the best form of government. Might be some other similarities that all pragmatists have, but those are the main ones. By the way, there's a fascinating book, if you're interested, by Louis Menon, called The Metaphysical Club. He won a Pulitzer for this one. And it's history, so it's one of those cool history books that embeds the philosophical ideas into the history, so that you get a good sense of why the ideas developed, how they developed kind of in the particular situation. And you've got the Civil War going on. Keep in mind that Charles Sanders Peirce would have been involved in the war because his father, who was a mathematician at the Lawrence Scientific Institute, was hired by the government, by Lincoln's government, to map the terrain around Washington, D.C., and as part of the team that he hired to do that, he included Charles Sanders Peirce's son. So you have both of them down mapping out the area around Washington, D.C. to help the military defend the area against what they expected to be the attack from the south, right? James never ended up in the military himself because of his health, but I believe he lost one of his brothers who died in the Civil War. Another philosopher that Manon talks about in this book, who was a friend of all of them and a member of the actual club. This was an actual club at Harvard that was called the Metaphysical Club. So that's where the title comes from. Was Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., who would become one of the Supreme Court justices of that time. A very significant member, and you can see American pragmatism being part of what is part of his decision-making process, right? Bless you. Another member of the American pragmatists was John Dewey. Although John Dewey would have been much younger at the time of the others, John Dewey was a college student at in his home of Vermont, where he went to Vermont College, I guess it was. Kind of odd. The whole family went together, so that I think he had like 4 brothers, and all of them, even though he was the youngest, they all went to college at the same time. Does that make sense? I don't know. John Dewey. Let me show a page on John Dewey. We're actually going to talk about John Dewey more next class. In fact, you can find videos, YouTube videos with John Dewey speaking. He lived to what, 1952? 1952. But after he graduated from Vermont College, he went to Johns Hopkins University, which was brand new, down in Maryland. And one of the teachers there was Charles Sanders Peirce. So Charles Sanders Peirce was a lecturer on logic, and John Dewey at least attended some of those lectures and somehow ended up becoming familiar with pragmatism through Charles Sanders Peirce. So a connecting link, really, between all of the early ones, including John Dewey, was Charles Sanders Peirce, whose definition of pragmatism was to study the meaning of words and understand that the meaning of words are tools that we use in a particular context to accomplish something. So pragmatism initially was an attempt to understand the meaning of words in particular contexts. James took it a next step and applied it as a theory of truth. So when we think of truth from, say, an epistemological point of view, how does truth work? There are certain basic theories. The one theory is the correspondence theory of truth. That's probably the one that we think of in the most commonsensical way. Correspondence means, well, when you say something, this book is on the table, there's actually a book that's on the table. We know what the table is, we know what the book is, etc., and how on works, etc. So we all would agree that, yes, the book is on the table. So a correspondence theory of truth. Statement is true because it corresponds to the actual way that reality is. So that's pretty easy. the other theory of truth, that's the main one, would be coherent theory of truth, the coherence theory of truth. So the reason 1 + 1 = 2 is not because really we have physical proof of that. You might say, yes, we do. Look, 1 + 1 = 2. Well, but remember that we are already convinced that 1 + 1 = 2 before we look at the experience. So the reason the two things equal 2 is not because, well, oh my goodness, there are two things there. The reason we believe that is because we already believe that 1 + 1 always equals 2, right? So the coherence comes first, and then we apply it to things. And if I saw two things sitting on the table, and every time I looked at it, oh, it was 3. Wait a minute, that's wrong. I would be confused by that, right? We look for things to be coherent. We expect people to be coherent. So one of the things, a lot of people make fun of Trump, because he says one thing, and then the next minute he says another thing, and it seems like, well, that's totally incoherent. How do we get out of that? Well, actually, that's where I think the pragmatic theory of truth comes in. Pragmatism, as James would basically explain it, is what works in practice, right? So there's some problems with this. Notice that this ties into the problem of evolution and Hegel, right? And James is much more of a Hegelian for sure. Remember, he studied in Germany much more. But if you think, well, wait a minute, truth kind of evolves, right? So what we believe now about, say, racial equality, right, is very different than what maybe they believed in the 1850s or 1700, right? So there's obviously, we might even say there's been moral progress in that respect, right? We certainly say that there's progress in other things as well, right? Microwaves, cars, you name it, right? More progress. By the way, if you saw the news item about the missionary that went to the island off of the coast of India, that India bans people from going to, because these people are like the most isolated group of people on earth. I don't know if you heard about it. And he absolutely wanted to go and preach to them, and so despite the fact that by going there he might have killed them all, because he's got all of his diseases that he's accumulated in his body since whenever, right? And they've got no immunities, we presume, to any of this stuff, right? So he might wipe them out just by meeting them, right? That's kind of what Columbus did to a large part of the indigenous population, hence Indian, right? Indigenous, right? Population of the Americas, right? So he endangered them, but also they've become famous for basically shooting at anybody that comes near them, right? And sure enough, that's precisely what they did to him, and so he's dead, right? So they killed him by shooting him. Yes?
You hear about that missionary who just died trying to convert a tribe out in the Pacific Ocean?
Is that a different guy?
It like just happened.
Yeah, that's the one I'm thinking of. I think, didn't I just describe that? Yeah, that's the one I'm thinking of. He's still in the news because everybody, they killed an American. Well, this was a really dumb American? Isn't that, well, that's kind of unfair to say. But in any case, he is dead. That's pretty clear. The fishermen that had taken him there, again, and by the way, they've been arrested for doing that, saw him being dragged, his corpse, along the beach after they had killed him and apparently buried on the beach. So, by the way, India is not sending anybody to go and try to retrieve the body, so that's interesting. The reason I brought that up, I don't remember now. What happened? What was I doing that for? To scroll back on my video and find out what the point was that I brought this up. Progress, etc. So obviously there are folks that are totally unaware of the progress, etc. But if that's the case, it seems like truth has to progress, right? So what people believed in the 1850s, everyone really would have voted on it, and said what's true about such and such, and then because of the unanimous approval of everyone on the place, they said, yes, she's a witch, burn her, right? Sorry. Well, if that truth becomes false, there's a couple issues involved here. How could people have been so misled that they all believed something was true when it turns out to be false to later generations, right? Aquinas certainly thought moral truth was something that was available. Notice that Kant certainly believed that. But if we read Hume, that becomes really a communitarian point of view. In other words, what's considered to be a moral truth depends on the community you grow up in. So what's true for you might not be true for someone else, right? It depends on your community. So the pragmatist theory of truth basically argues that truth is truth within a context. Number one, you have to be in a context. And that context is limited by the language that the people use and the beliefs they have, right? So just because it's true for them doesn't mean it's true for everybody, right? But that doesn't mean that what they believe is true isn't true for them. So apply that to Trump, for example, when within 5 minutes he says one thing, but then seems to deny it the next minute, right? Well, if we use the concept of context and language to say that in this particular case he's using this language in this particular context where he's responding to this question, and then in this context he's responding to a different one, we can easily end up saying that the meaning of what he was saying was different, so he's really not being incoherent. He's just talking in different contexts. So we could even say, so for example, Bertrand Russell uses what he calls a theory of types. Typical problem throughout history and philosophy is the liar's paradox, where you have the guy from Crete saying that all Cretans are liars. And of course he's a Cretan, so the paradox is, well, if you believe him, you're being foolish, because of course if he's telling the truth, he's lying. And you get into that paradox, right? If he's telling the truth, he's lying. So if he's lying, he's not telling the truth. So, what do you do? And by the way, Charles Sanders Peirce dealt with this kind of paradox. It's pretty interesting. I'm not going to be able to find it real. Well, let me just explain the theory of types. That's the easiest way of looking at it. Russell theory of types. All right, just okay, so famously, the barber of Seville shaves all of those who don't shave themselves. So the question becomes, who shaves the barber of Seville? I don't know if I did that really well or not. But basically, you're supposed to end up with this paradox where since he's shaving himself, then he's not one of the ones he shaves. Because he shaves all of those who don't shave themselves. So he can't shave himself. And yet, on the other hand, he's the only barber in town. So the question then is, who shaves the barber? That's right. You know, so you get into that same kind of a loop, right? Well, Russell's answer is the theory of types. So when we're creating a puzzle like that, what we have, like the Cretans. You know, so when the Cretan is using self-referential terminology, because he's talking about all Cretans and he's a Cretan, right? That puts his statement in a different type. So we could even label them type A, type B, type C, etc. And if it's a type B statement, as that is, all Cretans are liars, right? He's talking about all the Cretans in type A statements, but it can't include the type B statement that he's using to talk about all the other type statements, right? So, in other words, what we've got are different contexts where the meaning is different, right? So it looks initially like it should be self-referential and just confusing, right? But the idea that we've got different contexts and that it isn't self-referential basically takes you out of that conflict so that it's clear. Does that make sense? So take another example. If I'm in a bathroom where I've got mirrors on both sides of me and I see my mirror image an infinite, apparently, number of times, right? Infinite regression. It's easy to be confused about, you know, gee, what would I be confused about? It's actually just fun, right? You can see yourself going off, you know, into the distance, right? But actually what you could do is just say that, well, so this image is my reflection here. This image of my reflection in that mirror is exactly that, right? And then it has an image, you know, so literally you could just explain what's happening, right? I'm going from one image to another, right? And that takes away the confusion about why, gosh, it looks like an infinite, I'm not sure I'm explaining this right. There's a book by Hofstadter. I don't know if I showed you this or not, but the cover is Douglas Hofstadter, I Am a Strange Loop. That's the one hand in a picture taken by a VHS recorder that he used. This is an old book, right? And so what happened is it was on a feedback loop, so that while the camera was looking at the screen and he held the hand into the camera, you could see the hand on the screen, it's right. So it's the you get the idea. So he did that with a camera and a screen. So, but the idea, by the way, indicates where he's going with the topic there, that I am a strange loop, and that is that our concept of selfhood is essentially kind of this loop, that I've got these processes going on, and the processes themselves think of myself as a self, and et cetera, et cetera. So where does your self come from? It's these kind of infinitely regressive processes that are taking place. By the way, this reminds me of the concept of recursion. I don't know if I mentioned recursion. Anyway, if you look up recursion on Google, it will come up and ask you, did you mean recursion? And And if you look it up again, it'll come up and say, did you mean recursion? So it basically is a Google joke. Yes?
There's one for anagram that says nagaram.
Anagram.
And so if you do that, I'll say, did you mean nagaram?
Agaram.
Nagaram. Like
Nagar?
annoy, a ram.
so- But by the way, recursion is a process that Noam Chomsky argues is the main difference between human thinking and all other animals. That humans have the ability to be recursive, whereas other animals do not. There's other things that are kind of interesting in that way. One I was just reading this weekend actually argues that another characteristic of human beings that other animals apparently do not is that we think about future expectations. We can foresee future events, whereas other animals apparently cannot. So we can schedule things on the calendar, we can come up with theories. And what is a theory supposed to do? Explain what future results we might get from doing X and Y, whatever. Yes?
I heard something that other primates, they are only able to see, like, based on their physical needs at the moment, they're able to see it in the future, but they aren't able to, like, anticipate other future needs. So that's the main thing that separates us. So they're able to think ahead, but not as abstractly as us.
Pretty interesting, yeah. Okay. But so, the pragmatic theory of truth, when you get down to it, has to try to account for these kinds of progress. The truth will change. As a result, people like Dewey and others literally say we shouldn't use the word truth because when you use the word true and say, this is true, people expect that to remain the case, right? So what if 10 years later someone finds out that you were wrong, but everyone that believes it are absolutely adamant, no, it's true, I don't want to give it up, they're attached to it, right? Well, if we use a different word instead of true, it might be easier for us to kind of progress, where we're kind of more open to new ideas instead of being attached to truth. This is true, I believe it, my mom and dad believed it, so, and it's good enough for me, that kind of, it was good enough for Moses, then it's good enough for me, that kind of attitude. So instead, Dewey comes up with the concept of warranted assertion. So instead of saying this is true, you could say that this is a warranted assertion because at the moment, all of the data indicate that this is warrantedly assertable. But that is less likely to become something you're really attached to. In fact, the fun thing, I guess, with science today is that they say, funeral by funeral, science advances. So I'm screwing that one up, the definition or expression. Funeral by funeral science. Well, that is what the expression is. But you have to know that what he's talking about by funeral is not dead people, but scientific hypotheses that people believe. Hey, Sir Isaac Newton, oh my goodness, fantastic. But then Einstein, all that goes away. Well, it doesn't go away. We still use it because it's still a good tool. Right. Okay. So pragmatism, theory of truth. You can look that up. I think Wikipedia has. So when we think of the theory of truth, for pragmatists, correspondence is still part of it. Coherence is also still part of it, but it kind of adds still one more level to the theory of truth, and that is it useful? Does it work? Does this statement work in practice? If I have an upset stomach, have a small glass of bitters, that will help. Okay, you pour a small glass of bitters, whoa, that did help. That's true, right? See how that would work pretty easily. So being prepared for a changing situation is important. And John Dewey is, so Charles Sanders Peirce is going to be a mathematician and logician, and his impact of his work is going to be on language analysis and mathematics. William James is primarily a psychologist, and his impact is going to be on the field of psychology. He's considered to have taken psychology out of the armchair and into the laboratory. So instead of psychology being a matter of sitting in a chair and thinking about thinking and wondering, gee, how does thinking work? Well, it seems to me that this happens and this, etc. Instead, psychology after James is a matter of like behavioral psychology, laboratory study, trying to figure out what makes something happen. You know, the pigeons pecking the light, etc. All that kind of stuff, and it follows from James. And Dewey is primarily an educator. So when we think of pragmatism, thanks to John Dewey, we think of him applying the educational practices based on his studies of Hegel. So if Hegel's logic basically says, well, we've got this dialectical process. Here's the current situation. It automatically creates its own antithesis. Like sitting in a chair. You first come in the room and you sit down and you're tired from hiking or something, the chair feels comfortable. But if you sit there too long, your cheek starts to fall asleep, right? So you've got to move. So thesis, antithesis, creates a new synthesis, which is essentially the new situation, right? So the process of change keeps going from one thing to the next, right? There's never a static situation that way. Well, if that's the case, then an educational process ought to teach people how to deal with that. And so what young people are supposed to get at school is a theory of inquiry, how to learn to solve problems, right? Not just memorize, classic texts or something, but instead learn how to think to solve problems, which requires kind of this scientific process, right? Okay, so pragmatism. So we'll do John Dewey next class. That sounds funny. Do Dewey? We'll do Dewey. Charles Sanders Peirce. His life was kind of interesting, by the way, but only for a while. Because what happened was he worked with his dad in the National Geodetic Survey while they were mapping the area around Washington, D.C. Meanwhile, he was also working to measure the speed of light. How you do that? It's really hard for me to imagine measuring the speed of light. Every time I get my ruler out, it's just too fast. And then he was teaching philosophy and teaching at Johns Hopkins University. Now the interesting thing was that while he was at Johns Hopkins, he ended up falling in love with a French woman who was on the outs with her husband, but she was still married to him. And so he actually dated a married woman. eventually she got a divorce, and they married, and they lived happily, well, not happily, but they lived, forever after, whatever, until he died. And then I guess she eventually died, so that happens. But because he did that, which is against all rules and proper etiquette, etc., he was fired. And in fact, that's such a horrendous thing, dating a married woman, that he was never hired anywhere else ever again. So he ended up going to Arizbi. We easily look up. Okay, so this is not just his house, this is like the website of people in America that love Charles Sanders Peirce. But there is a house which you could actually still go visit. There it is. So it's in the Delaware Water Gap in Pennsylvania, if you're in that area. It's kind of sitting there all alone, although about 2 miles down the road is a big Walmart, so it's not all by itself. Yeah, and so as far as I know, it's not a very heavily visited museum, but it's still there. But so he moved there and spent the rest of his life writing and drinking booze, which I guess is not really the best thing to do. Didn't make any money, so the reason he didn't starve to death was because William James kept giving him money. So as Cornel West was saying, James was helping everybody. He was out there giving money to all sorts of folks. The James family was wealthy, so that helped. Yes, by the way, if you're familiar with Henry James, he was William James's younger brother. Does that make sense? Yes. He's the author of a lot of really boring books. I don't know if you're familiar with the Turning of the Screw, Washington Square. Do you read any Henry James? My Russian teacher in the Defense Language Institute, Gospoja Foreman, we get to know people, and so I asked her at one point, what's her favorite American author? And right away she said, Henry James. So Henry James, and I thought, oh yes, that's the closest American author I can imagine to the kind of Russian authors that are, like Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. Exactly the same kind of.
But Dostoevsky's great.
Yes, but it's that in Raskolnikov, right? The rascal, right? Actually, Raskolnikov is the little rascal, literally, right? But so much depth. Why he's sweating, why he's sleeping on his couch and all upset, and what's going through his mind, and just hundreds of pages of this until finally he turns himself in. And you're like, sorry, did I ruin it for you? Crime and Punishment. Nakazenia, no. Forget the Russian for crime and punishment. Stuplenia I Nakazania, something like that. I forget. Okay, well, in any case, Henry James writes the same kind of novel. Notice this is about the same time period, actually. What else? I need a quiz question. So on the test, I already asked lots of questions about pragmatism. What's the connection between pragmatism and American philosophy? Well, it is American philosophy. what is the relationship between pragmatism and American culture? So what other kind of
You talk about like another word for truth.
do you have other words for truth?
Well, like how like our definition of truth like influences like our inability to change our thinking.
Okay, how's that work? How could we define that? So, Dewey gives us a warranted assertion. He literally thought we should get rid of the word truth because it just creates problems for us. Obviously, that was a dismal failure because we still use the word truth. True, right?
Yeah.
We still use truth. We like truth. We like truth, etc. But how do you feel about the idea that what's true today might not be considered true tomorrow? Is that fair? What's true, what we think of as true today, we might not think of as true tomorrow.
Is that the new question?
Yeah. How's that? So how do you feel about the idea that what we think is true today might not be thought of as true tomorrow? So what I'm thinking is, it used to be that if you thought that something was true, you thought it was true all the time. Had been for Aristotle, it was true for Moses, it would be true for me, right? But today, haven't we gotten used to the idea that what we think might be true is true, can change? Or is that still a conflict? Remember when we talked about Quine, and he talked about the web of belief, the more important truths for us are in that middle of the web, and the exterior of the web is kind of what comes in contact with change in our environment. And so as things happen to the exterior of the web, it kind of can screw up the web and you have to rebuild the web, right? But it's very rare that things will actually affect the very center of the web. The bee that gets stuck in the middle of the web and you have to go and rebuild it. In a sense, those are metaphors, of course, for something you learn that you didn't know before that changes your web of belief, right? The very set of truths that you think are important to you end up being changed. And I think we live in a society where everything is faster. That's James Gleick, faster. This is an old book. That could be funny if you think like that. How old is it? 2000. That's 18 years old. 18 years old. My goodness. His newest book, by the way, is on time travel. I actually already read, of course. Where'd it go? Hey, what did this go to? Time travel, the history. By the way, it's not really about time travel, it's about literature about time travel. So if you're reading that for the physics of it, that's wrong. Don't go read it for that.
What's your
More
name
about,
says
pardon?
the digital copy is more expensive than if you ordered a book.
Good.
That bothers me.
Buy paper. Kill trees.
$3.29. Of course, you also have postage too.
Oh, it's free with
With,
Prime.
with the Kindle, you don't have postage.
This really bothers me.
Well, if you want, I could lend you my copy if I could find it. I should be able to find it.
I haven't read a book since.
Oh, we've had this discussion. We've had this discussion. Okay.
Watch plenty of videos.
Is it okay? That's my addiction. What did I do over the holiday? I've been reading books. We finished a couple. It's like what I do. It's that consumerism thing, I feel like I've got to consume massive quantities of information. Helps me fall asleep at night, helps me eat food while I'm at the table. It's reading. First thing I do in the morning is go out and get the newspaper, and then I realize, oh crap, I should have put on a robe.
Okay.
Because it's cold.
Yeah.
Oh,
I don't know how to word it.
English would be good.
Yeah, that's